be in Oklahoma. I went to school here, actually. University of Phoenix, online. Played volleyball, obviously. I live by a school, and I'm allowed to. And it's weird to live by a school, because I would see kids in the neighborhood walking home from school by themselves. It's always the loser kids with no friends. I was getting sentimental because it used to be me. I was wanting to go up to him like, hey, I'm you from the future. Go make some friends. This doesn't work out well for us, you know? Just yelling at random kids on the street, drop that stupid stick, you're not a wizard. Girls aren't gonna like you. He's like, those are my crutches. Whatever, loser, get out of my face. This is going to be a good show. I just turned 35, which means I love my parents now. That's new. It takes a while, you know. I guess that's what happens as you get older. You relate to them more. Not that 35 is old. I'm not moving to Florida, but, you know, it's different. When I was 20, I was like, I'm invincible. I'll party all night. Now I'm in my 30s, I'm like, I can't leave the house, I had too much dairy. You know what I mean? Like, things change. I used to try to fix stuff. I'd be like, oh, my neck hurts, I'll go to the chiropractor. Now I'm like, it just won't look left. That's fine.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Enemies of My Country Saturday, January the 20th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity prayer and the patriotic song of the day, I will have no free lunch, rules for radical conservatives, rules for retrogrades, rules for patriots, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 strategies of war, and the enemies of my country. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I shouldn't change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now, there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
Human action. Human civilization is not something achieved against nature. It is rather the outcome of the working of the innate qualities of man. Ludwig von Mises. I can summarize what economics is this way. Man was made in the image of God, with properties of independence, creativity, aspiration, and self-preservation. The actions of man as created beings reflect man's internal qualities, and in the aggregate form civilizations. Human action is economics, and economics is human action. At the root of economics will always be the human person, not a mathematical model. Indeed, at the root of civilization will always be the failures and triumphs of mankind.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for radical conservatives.
Fairness and tolerance. As discussed earlier, we progressives have abandoned God's commandments as the relics of the judgmental, pre-destructionist, patriarchal culture they so obviously are. We reject your father-knows-best fascism in all its manifestations, and this most definitely includes those silly rules that Moses allegedly brought down from Mount Sinai, the better to found a monstrous conspiracy known as monotheism, and thus make our lives difficult thousands of years later. Okay, not exactly abandon them, but edited them. Replace them with a couple of simple rules that have served us well, if only as protective coloring, in our war against you. Just as a yellow dog who knows he's about to be seriously eviscerated by a bigger, meaner canine rolls over on his back and shows his belly and his balls, his most vulnerable bits, as it were, in the hopes that the big dog will take that as a sign of surrender and thus spare him, so have we perfected the art of pretending to surrender. When every so often you finally rouse yourselves to call us out over one trivial provocation or another, all the while planning and plotting to live and stab you in the back another day. Yes, I know this makes us sound like the cowards we are, but that's exactly why you find it so hard to fight us. You can't hit a girl. And basically, we're all girls. Not that there's anything wrong with that. You're a lonely, ugly arsehole, and you must accept it, says Tony to Colin in Richard Curtis's brilliant script for Love Actually. Never. I am Colin, god of sex, replies his friend. And you know, he was right. As long as you buy into our transparently phony posturing and premises, because you want to believe, because not to do so would be rude, or worse, bigoted in some fashion, we have you at our underdog mercy. We are the gods of sex, and you are the lonely, ugly arseholes, instead of vice versa. One of the reasons we pretended to be horrified by what happened on 9/11, why we had to endure all those tedious candlelight vigils outside the Capitol, feigning horror at the senseless loss of life, when deep down we were secretly thinking, we deserved it. Hit us, Berber, one more time. Was that, as usual, we had to conceal our true feelings so that we wouldn't let the mask slip and reveal how much we despise you and your unwarranted, overbearing, tiresome pride in your own country. This is what we have done to your culture, where once real men used to take it outside and settle it like real men. Today we whine, we cry, and if all else fails, we sue. Think of us as Bernie Birnbaum in the Coen brothers' greatest film, Miller's Crossing, falling on his knees in sheer crocodile tear cowardice and begging the Irish gangster, played by Gabriel Byrne, for his life. Look in your heart, Tom, he cries, and whines and whinges and weeps, and, well, to his everlasting regret, Tom lets him go. Like the aliens in Independence Day, we're using your own weapons, your strength, your decency, your sense of fair play, and your laughable compassion against you. Because while you wingnuts are busy getting bogged down in the house-to-house fighting of Rambo versus El Rushbo, or whatever clownish sideshow we have managed to distract you with this month, the larger point of what's happening to you is sailing right over your fat heads. You're letting yourselves get bogged down in minutia when you should really be seeing the Burnham wood behind Dunsinane's trees. For in the end, our cold civil war against you conservatives and your institutions is not really about personalities or even policies. It's about principles. Meanwhile, you would rather discuss policies. And what, besides blame America first, are those principles? What are our greatest commandments? Not being congenitally Christian, we of course reject the message of Jesus, who boiled the patriarchal laws of Moses down to two nifty aphorisms: love God and love thy neighbor as thyself. When you get right down to it, that's pretty much all Christianity is. If you leave out the racism, sexism, homophobia, school prayer, cucumber sandwiches, dancing with your maiden aunts at weddings, drinking at funerals, and of course the Spanish Inquisition. Our strictures, however, have a much more positive spin than the dreary list of don'ts inscribed upon Moses' tablets, and they're much more modern than Jesus' goody two-shoes bromides. You probably already know what they are, but in case you don't, here we go. Fairness and tolerance. Sure, they're not in any Bible, Torah, or Quran that I know about. And naturally, being an atheist and all, I'm hard-pressed to cite a scriptural reference for any of them, except for maybe The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, which was all the rage in my dad's day. You don't want to know how many times he scored with a few lines from this Age of Aquarius precursor, written by a Lebanese Maronite Christian who was raised in Beantown, South End. Suckers! And what do we mean by fairness and tolerance? Not, of course, what you think. As should be clear by now, we never use a word with a uniform meaning that's clear to both sides when we can use one with a double meaning, one of which is invisible and inaudible to you. As Churchill said of Britain and America, the left and the right in America today are two nations separated by a common language. We dwell on a one-way street in which the traffic goes the way we say it goes, and it is no small measure of our success over the past half-century or so that you have never been able to figure that out. Take fairness. Sounds unexceptionable, right? That's exactly what we want you to think. Who could possibly be against fairness? Except for maybe Ayn Rand and the Atlas Shrugged kooks. In our view, everything in modern America is unfair if it results in the slightest disparity in income, lifestyle, job description, or the availability of chicken McNuggets at your local fast food place, which we'll soon be shuttering in the interests of the people's health. No further need to call 911. And we are more than willing to sacrifice everything you have in pursuit of this social justice. Sure, it'll make you mad for a while as we looters systematically sack your homes, smash your pianos, and turn over your spare rooms to the wretched of the earth. But after a while, you'll come to accept it, and even embrace it. Shared misery. What could be fairer? Vesuvia vlast Sovietum. All power to the Soviets. If I were you, I'd get used to wrapping my lips around that particular phrase. Because if we have our way, you're going to be shouting it at rallies in Times Square, Pershing Square, Union Square, and from the balcony of the Drake Hotel, if you know what's good for you. I realize that to you, fairness means treating all people equally, giving everyone the same chance, putting aside the old prejudices in favor of a colorblind society. To us, though, it means exactly the opposite. Just as in Islam, peace means one thing to the formerly and thankfully no longer Christian, what are you going to do with all those empty cathedrals, world, and quite another to the Ummah. So does fairness have a separate but equal resonance. To us, fairness simply means we win, you lose, no matter what the rules of the game. Are we perchance the minority in Congress? Very well then. Simple fairness dictates that you let us wield inordinate influence, all out of proportion to our numbers. Otherwise, we will simply roll over onto our backs and show you our belly until you accommodate us. And in those joyous, happy days when we have lied, wheedled, and cajoled our way to power, and have been by some miracle of obfuscation voted into the electoral majority by the American people, who would far rather be watching Dancing with the Stars on their giant, flat-screen TVs than having to think about politics, well then, fairness means what it used to mean, back when men were men and tort lawyers got punched in the face in the back alleys behind bars. Took it and liked it, lest they get the crap beaten out of them again and again, until they stopped threatening to financially beggar a man with whom they had some slight disagreement. And so to tolerance. For decades, we have been provoking you, goading you, mocking you, denigrating you, challenging your faith in God and country and yourselves, while at the same time demanding that you tolerate us. For us, there is no greater virtue than tolerance, since our definition of it means accepting not the best of a group with whom you may differ, but the worst. Remember that for us, there is no goal but your destruction, and tolerance is perhaps our favorite weapon, especially when blended with incrementalism. At the beginning of our effort to break down your society, we quite reasonably noted the disparity between your professed beliefs and how you actually lived your lives, how you treated other people. What happened next was a bit of an intellectual trick, but once we fooled you with it, well, the results are evident all around you. Understanding that human beings are naturally clannish and suspicious of outsiders, we had to get you to accept two mutually exclusive propositions and keep them both in your mind simultaneously. Rather like the White Queens being able to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast in Alice in Wonderland. On the one hand, you had to believe that there were absolutely no differences among racial or ethnic groups, that we were all part of the brotherhood of man. It said so, right there in your Declaration of Independence, and that welcoming everyone to and absorbing them into your society would make absolutely no difference to the proper functioning of your democracy.
And that was part 1 of Chapter 16 from Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left.
Rule 28. For radicals, the issue is never the real issue. Don't be fooled. Whatever it happens to be, radicals' talking point du jour is invariably a mere ruse aimed at achieving a darker, more nefarious, more strategic, long-term goal. Mod cons often make the mistake of engaging radicals on the substance of their talking points, as if radicals are advocating for or against a given policy in good faith. But this is folly. The talking points of radicals, their issues of the day, are always mere Trojan horses for accomplishing a deeper agenda. When radicals take up the mantle of a given issue, it's as an avenue for pursuing something far more profound. So, you'll never be able to get a hardened radical to abandon his endorsement of, let's say, expansive firearms restrictions, even if you offer irrefutable proof that crime rates are lower and murders are fewer in areas where legal gun carriage proliferates. The issue for the radical was never truly an intolerable level of violent crimes. That was all a decoy, a convenient setting for emotive lip service aimed at providing the justification for a reimagined society. Mod cons would be well served to understand, for example, that the debate over gun control isn't about reducing deaths. It's about making people more dependent on government by depriving them of self-sufficiency. Likewise, the debate over abortion isn't about a woman's right to choose. It's about freeing women from the home by enabling women's careerism. The debate over unfettered immigration isn't about relieving the world's poor, tired, huddled masses. It's about ushering in globalism and undermining the sovereignty of the nation-state. The debate over raising taxes isn't really about balancing the budget. It's about income redistribution. The debate over climate change isn't really about protecting the environment. It's about handicapping the economies of first world nations so that third world nations can achieve parity of wealth. The debate over gay marriage isn't about equality of rights. It's about debasing and undermining matrimony and the family, which are viewed as patriarchal and oppressive. The debate about trans rights isn't about respecting human dignity. It's about undermining the moral order and crushing sexual taboos. The true believers, those wonks who become embroiled on the radical side of the foregoing fights, fail to comprehend that they are mere pawns in a larger game that is being played by cleverer people. If you don't know whether or not you're a pawn, then you're a pawn. On a meta level, what radicals are really pursuing is a humanist utopia, a world without borders, class distinction, sex distinction, and wealth inequality, a world where each man is free to live out his unique artistic identity, doing as he pleases, unshackled from arbitrary constraints placed upon him by a domineering ruling class. It's a subjectivist, existentialist vision wherein each man can make of himself what he wills, serving not God, but his own whims, and thereby ostensibly the community. Till this ultimate stage of the radical vision is achieved, the state must be grown and empowered so that it can be used as a bludgeon to implement the unnatural policies that will ensure the attainment of the longed-for utopia. But out of fear of backlash, radicals have to scheme to bring about their new order in secret. they can't broadcast what they plan to do because it would prove fatally unpopular. So they have to implement their grand vision piecemeal, never tipping their hand till all becomes clear in one phonic denouement. Be reminded that the radical vision is an inherently godless vision, one that must be heartily rebuffed by the retrograde. Efficient causes, creators, imbue their creations with final cause, with purpose. Since God is our creator, we cannot choose our own purposes in life. To decide man's purpose is God's unique privilege, and he has decreed, once and for all, that our purpose is to know, love, and serve him. Living life outside of these parameters leads only to misery and ruination. That said, we need to attack the radical vision in its unmasked form. There is no use debating an endless litany of decoy issues with radicals, except to temporarily stave off an attack. Rather, we need to attack the philosophical errors that are at the core of radicals' doctrine. Becoming bogged down in the morass of policy minutiae with radicals is a fool's errand, since their mania for the utopian state moves them to ignore the illogic of the many planks of their platform, just as the tail wags the dog.
And that was the Rule 28 from Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left by Timothy and David Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Rules for Patriots by Steve Deese.
Justice, law, education, validation, charity, etc. in the society. And that something usually ends up being the state. As G.K. Chesterton once observed, when government removes God, government then becomes the God. Next question. What kind of tax system is most effective? Answer. The tax and monetary system that was in place in this country prior to 1913, which was prior to the confiscatory federal income tax and the printing of a fiat currency, that helped encourage the greatest growth of human freedom and prosperity the world has ever known. Since abandoning that foundation, we have increasingly become a debtor nation/people. I may have gone to public school and not the Ludwig von Mises Institute for Advanced Austrian Libertarian Economics, but even I'm smart enough to know to go back to what worked before. Question. How do high taxes on the wealthy impact an economy? Answer. Every job I've ever had came from a rich person, so I'm not sure how punitively punishing the very people who provide jobs will create more of them. Question. What is the cause and solution to poverty? Answer. The greatest way to combat poverty is to first recognize what causes it in the first place. Sinful human nature. Sometimes that sinful human nature manifests itself as a robber baron who exploits the community's natural and human resources, thus making it harder, if not impossible, for his fellow man to maximize his God-given talent so he can provide for himself and his family. Sometimes that sinful human nature manifests itself in the wrongful choices individuals make that put their livelihood and prosperity at risk. Either way, this is the reason why God gave the church the primary role of distributing charity in human society, because ultimately the church has the moral message to confront the evils that cause poverty in the first place. When an amoral agent like the state intervenes instead, the best it can do is apply a Band-Aid to a flesh wound. It can treat the symptom, but it lacks the prescription to become the cure. Then, after a while, it becomes an enabler of the very thing it's trying to fix, just like it is today. Question. What role do workers' unions play in an economy? Answer. Human history has shown that whenever power is concentrated in the hand of a few, or just one, corruption is bound to take place regardless of the belief system of those or the one in whose hands the power lies. That's why historically unions played a vital role as a check and balance on unfettered corporate power. Obviously, unions have also struggled with the same fallen nature manifested as corruption that corporatists have. Nowadays, unfortunately, unions, particularly government sector unions, do not primarily serve the needs of their workers, but are more or less a funding stream and campaign platform for the Democrat Party. So while the union bosses have a seat at the table, the workers are worse off. Question: how does a minimum wage requirement impact an economy? Answer: how can a government know what the minimum wage should be? Can anyone even support a family on the minimum wage? Here is the reality. Real wages in this country have declined in relation to the rate of inflation/debt since these sorts of government schemes to contrive equality began. Our wages nowadays do not have the buying power in a consumer-driven economy they once had, which is one of the reasons we carry so much debt. Just about every major purchase a family makes these days is made on credit. These schemes are actually harming the very people they purport to help because they're operating outside the natural laws of economics. Let me give an example. Suppose a movie theater owner has calculated the job of popcorn attendant is worth $5 an hour based on his business model and the current job market. In other words, based on finite objective standards. However, the government comes in and mandates he pay a minimum of $10 an hour for that job instead, under the subjective guise of fairness. The movie theater owner doesn't just cut into his own profit margin to cover the increased cost out of the kindness of his own heart, but rather jacks up the price of popcorn to pass along his cost to the consumer. Now the market, tethered by competition, is no longer setting the price, but government artificially is. That sounds well and good until you and I go buy a popcorn the next time we're at the theater, and we're still making the same amount of money we were making before the price got jacked up. Since we can't go back to our bosses and demand a raise to cover our popcorn habit, right away our buying power is diminished by this government intrusion into a consumer-driven economy. Not to mention, so is the popcorn attendants. Because on his night off, when he takes his date to the movies, he'll notice he's making more money, but now this date is costing him more money too. He's essentially being given the bill for his own minimum wage increase. And he'll notice the same thing at the restaurant he takes her to, and everywhere else where entry-level workers were given a completely contrived minimum wage increase. In other words, his minimum wage increase is at best a revenue-neutral transaction once the arbitrary consumer price increase offsets the arbitrary minimum wage increase he got from Uncle Sam. Meaning, at best, he'll break even, and most of the time, it's a loss leader. This partially explains why the explosion in government since 2007 has led to a reduction in American wealth to 1992 levels. We're buying goods and services at 2012 prices with a standard of living that is 20 years old. We have a saying on our radio show, why be in a hurry to be wrong? I know our willingness to immediately comment on things we actually haven't researched and analyzed frustrates some in this instant gratification world, but it also helps us to sleep well at night and avoid looking foolish, as the Huffington Post recently did. Headline said fast food workers are demanding a living wage of $15 an hour. Of course, how do we know that's actually a living wage? Why not demand $20 an hour, or $50 an hour, or $100 an hour? A full-time job that pays $15 an hour comes out to $31,200 a year, not counting overtime. Can you really live the American dream, own a home, own a car, send your kids to good schools, and then eventually college, one family vacation per year on $31,200? After all, the federal poverty line for a family of four is currently $23,550 per year, but I digress. Of course, never wanting an opportunity to play class warfare, outlets like the Huffington Post, owned by Arianna Huffington, who's got a net worth of $35 million, so of course she identifies with the plight of the downtrodden, were overly eager to report as fact analysis of McDonald's financials from an alleged University of Kansas research assistant named Arnobio Moralex. Moralex reported that if McDonald's immediately doubled all the wages of its employees, including the $9 million CEO, it would only have to raise the cost of a Big Mac by 68 cents and its dollar menu to $1.17 per item. This comes out to a measly 17% price increase. It all sounds well and good, of course, in magical thinking land, but there's one small problem. Moralex is full of shinola. First of all, you can't on one hand simply imply McDonald's is a greedy corporation that refuses to pay its employees a living wage and then fail to recognize that if McDonald's could get away with just arbitrarily raising their prices by 17%, they already would have done it. Wouldn't the greedy corporation you're smearing actually be bilking employees and customers at the same time if they could? Of course they would. Especially since customers pay into the business model, while employees are overhead that subtract from it. Hello, McFly? Anybody home? The reality is, just as employees want to make more money, so does the company. Employees would like to make $15 an hour instead of $7.50, and McDonald's would like to charge $10 per Big Mac instead of $3.99 as well. But if McDonald's isn't the federal government able to just print more money whenever it wants, that means McDonald's has to live within the natural laws of economics, which state you can't spend more than you have, and if you don't make a profit, you're out of business, and that means all the jobs are gone too. That simple application of common sense should have shown the Huffington Post that hitching its wagon to Moralex was a bridge to nowhere. But when thinking emotionally, common sense is in short supply. We don't have time to think for ourselves, mind you, when we're too busy reporting the story we want to be true, even if it's not. By the way, it turns out Moralex isn't a research assistant at the University of Kansas either. He's actually just an undergraduate student there. When it printed its correction story, the Huffington Post said they ran with the story without fact-checking any of Moralex's so-called data themselves. For example, the Huffington Post said prior to the publication, they asked Moralex if his analysis included franchises, and he said that it did. My translation, hey, this college kid told us what we wanted to hear, so we just took it all at face value. I wish my editors at places like USA Today would afford me the same courtesy when I submit a column. Instead, I routinely have to provide multiple sources for my assertions. By the way, it turns out Moralex didn't factor in McDonald's franchise business model, which accounts for more than 80% of McDonald's restaurants worldwide.
And that was the second part of Chapter 6, Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again, by Steve Deese. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, the daily laws for January the 20th.
January 20th. See mastery as salvation. The misery that oppresses you lies not in your profession, but in yourself. What man in the world would not find his situation intolerable if he chooses a craft, an art, indeed any form of life, without experiencing an inner calling? Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. The world is teeming with problems, many of them of our own creation. To solve them will require a tremendous amount of effort and creativity. Relying on genetics, technology, magic, or being nice and natural will not save us. We require the energy not only to address practical matters, but also to forge new institutions and orders that fit our changed circumstances. We must create our own world, or we will die from inaction. We need to find our way back to the concept of mastery that defined us as a species so many millions of years ago. This is not mastery for the purpose of dominating nature or other people, but for determining our fate. The passive ironic attitude is not cool or romantic, but pathetic and destructive. You are setting an example of what can be achieved as a master in the modern world. You are contributing to the most important cause of all, the survival and prosperity of the human race in a time of stagnation. And you must convince yourself of the following. People get the mind and quality of brain that they deserve through their actions in life. Daily law. You must see your attempt at attaining mastery as something extremely necessary and positive. Mastery, Chapter 1. Discover your calling, the life's task.
And that was the daily law for January the 20th from Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Bishop Robert Barron.
People say, okay, well, Bishop, how do you argue? Can I propose a little two-step, and it's inspired by Thomas Aquinas. Someone makes a claim, right, against something you believe. Here's the first step. Identify something in that claim that's right. Because invariably there will be, unless the person is completely insane. Begin not with, you're an idiot, shut up, but begin with, yeah, you know what, actually, something you're saying here is true. Here's the second little simple move. Distinguish. Make the distinction that brings out where you think what you're saying is true over and against the claim they're making. It's a little two-step dance. Acknowledge the truth of it, make the distinction. Now watch something here. Instead of simply fighting, you say A, I say not A, and bop, 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 we fight. What I proposed is like a little dance. We'll take two steps together. We're kind of dancing, I hope, in the direction of the truth. We're actually moving together toward something beyond both of us, which is the fullness of truth.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, "It is the educational establishment that has created this national disaster. It is philosophy that has created the educational establishment. The anti-rational philosophic trend of the past 200 years has run its course and reached its climax. To oppose it will require a philosophical revolution, or rather, a rebirth of philosophy," unquote. And that was the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Back in a minute. Thank you. If you're a Democrat, a right-thinking Democrat, you need to vote Republican and become a Republican. We are the true party of government. We are the ones that love government. The Democrat Party just loves power. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the 33 strategies of war.
Determining what they believe and want, then apparently conforming to them until the situation can be exploited. Definition: when the enemy wants to take something and you yield it, it is termed according with. In general, when going contrary to something merely solidifies it, it is better to accord with it in order to lead them to flaws. If the enemy wants to advance, be completely flexible and display weakness in order to induce an advance. If the enemy wants to withdraw, disperse and open an escape route for their retreat. If the enemy is relying upon a strong front, establish your own front lines far off, solidly assuming a defensive posture in order to observe their arrogance. If the enemy relies upon their awesomeness, be emptily respectful, but substantially plan while awaiting their laxness. Draw them forward and cover them, release and capture them. Exploit their arrogance, capitalize on their laxity. By Karl von Clausewitz. A rapid, powerful transition to the attack, the glinting sword of vengeance, is the most brilliant moment of the defense. From History of the Art of War in the Middle Ages, by Sir Charles Oman. A sudden inspiration then came to William at the Battle of Hastings, A.D. 1066, suggested by the disaster which had befallen the English right in the first conflict. He determined to try the expedient of a feigned flight, a stratagem not unknown to Bretons and Normans of earlier ages. By his orders, a considerable portion of the assailants suddenly wheeled about and retired in seeming disorder. The English thought, with more excuse on this occasion than on the last, that the enemy was indeed routed, and for the second time a great body of them broke the line and rushed after the retreating squadrons. When they were well on their way down the slope, William repeated his former procedure. The intact portion of his host fell upon the flanks of the pursuers, while those who had simulated flight faced about and attacked them in front. The result was again a foregone conclusion. The disordered men of the feared were hewn to pieces, and few or none of them escaped back to their comrades on the height. From the Wiles of War, 36 Military Strategies from Ancient China. When the enemy finds itself in a predicament and wants to engage us in a decisive battle, wait. When it is advantageous for the enemy but not for us to fight, wait. When it is expedient to remain still, and whoever moves first will fall into danger, wait. When two enemies are engaged in a fight that will result in defeat or injury, wait. When the enemy forces, though numerous, suffer from mistrust and tend to plot against one another, wait. When the enemy commander, though wise, is handicapped by some of his cohorts, wait. From Secrets of the Samurai by Oscar Rotti and Adele Westbrook. These two main principles of application are specifically related to the tactical value assigned to the personality of the opponent in combat. According to the unilateral principle of application, the personality of the opponent was considered the primary target of an attack or counterattack for the purpose of either total or partial subjugation. According to the bilateral principle of application, on the other hand, the opponent's personality was viewed not merely as a target, but also, and by certain bujutsu masters primarily, as an instrument, that is, as the unwilling but nevertheless useful vector of his own subjugation. It is the principle of bilateral application which seems to represent a tactical differentiation between Japanese bujutsu and the martial arts of the West. Lafcadio Hearn, for example, considered this principle a uniquely Oriental idea, asking what Western brain could have elaborated this strange teaching. Never to oppose force to force, but only to direct and utilize the power of attack, to overthrow the enemy solely by his own strength, to vanquish him solely by his own efforts. Takuan, writing about the art of swordsmanship in particular, refers to the strategic value of the bilateral principle and the strategy of counterattack against an opponent, when he advised his pupil to make use of his attack by turning it onto himself. Then, his sword meant to kill you becomes your own, and the weapon will fall on the opponent himself. In Zen, this is known as seizing the enemy's spear and using it as the weapon to kill him. The ancient schools of jujutsu were very empathetic on this subject. Jujutsu, literally soft art, as its name implies, is based on the principle of opposing softness or elasticity to hardness or stiffness. Its secret lies in keeping one's body full of chi, with elasticity in one's limbs, and in being ever on the alert to turn the strength of one's foe to one's own advantage, with the minimum employment of one's own muscular force. From the Wiles of War, 36 Military Strategies from Ancient China. To undertake the military operations, the army must prefer stillness to movement. It reveals no shape when still, but exposes its shape in movement. When a rash movement leads to exposure of the shape of the army, it will fall victim to the enemy. But for movement, the tiger and leopard will not fall into trap, the deer will not run into snare, the birds will not be stuck by net, and the fish and turtles will not be caught by hooks. All these animals become prey to man because of their movement. Therefore the wise man treasures stillness. By keeping still, he can dispel temerity and cope with the temerarious enemy. When the enemy exposes a vulnerable shape, seize the chance to subdue it. The Book of Master Wei Yao observes, the army achieves victory by stillness. Indeed, the army should not move without careful thought, much less take reckless action. From The House at Pooh Corner by A. A. Milne. The Heffalump Trap. Piglet and Pooh have fallen into a hole in the floor of the forest. They have agreed that it is really a heffalump trap, which makes Piglet nervous. He imagines that a heffalump has landed close by. Heffalump, gloatingly. Ho-ho! Piglet, carelessly. Tra-la-la, tra-la-la. Heffalump, surprised and not quite so sure of himself. Ho-ho! Piglet, more carelessly still. Tiddle-um-tum, tiddle-um-tum. Heffalump, beginning to say ho-ho and turning it awkwardly into a cough. Oh, what's all this? Piglet, surprised. Hello! This is a trap I've made, and I'm waiting for a heffalump to fall into it. Heffalump, greatly disappointed. Oh. After a long silence, are you sure? Piglet, yes. Heffalump, oh. Nervously, I thought it was a trap I'd made to catch piglets. Piglet, surprised. Oh, no. Heffalump, oh. Apologetically, I must have got it wrong then. Piglet, I'm afraid so. Politely, I'm sorry. He goes on humming. Heffalump, I suppose I'd better be getting back. Piglet, looking up carelessly. Must you? Well, if you see Christopher Robin anywhere, you might tell him I want him. Heffalump, eager to please. Certainly, certainly. He hurries off. Pooh, who wasn't going to be there, but we find we can't do without him. Oh, Piglet, how brave and clever you are. Piglet, modestly. Not at all, Pooh. And then when Christopher Robin comes, Pooh can tell him all about it. From The Book of Five Rings, by Miyamoto Musashi. The notion of catching, utsurasuru, applies to many things. Yawning and sleepiness, for example. Time can also be catching. In a large-scale battle, when the enemy is restless and trying to bring a quick conclusion to the battle, pay no attention. Instead, try to pretend that you are calm and quiet, with no urgent need to end the battle. The enemy will then be affected by your calm and easy attitude and become less alert. When this catching occurs, quickly execute a strong attack to defeat the enemy.
And that was the next section of chapter 9, Turn the Tables, from the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. I just can't listen to him anymore. I'm listening to Hugh Hewitt and talking about he's describing himself again as center-right, not as a conservative. So that's one of the things, to be a true conservative, you've got to admit that you're conservative. You got to tell people when they ask, that are asking in good faith, by the way, that you are conservative. Center-right doesn't cut it. That's crap. Okay? Then he goes on to say that Mitch McConnell is the best Republican senator ever. It makes me want to barf. He did some good things, although I don't know what the hell else he could do. He's with the Supreme Court. That's what Hugh Hewitt is basing his accolades on, the Supreme Court. I say so what and not good enough, not nearly good enough. But again, listen, when you're listening to talk show hosts, right-wing talk show hosts, listen, do they describe themselves as conservative? No. No, they don't. They don't describe themselves as Christian, except for the one guy that comes on at 9 o'clock, and he's Jewish, and so he talks about God. So good for him. But very few of these people actually describe themselves as conservative. You have people like, Hugh Hewitt. Center-right. There's no such thing. And this is what is such a screwball is Hugh Hewitt, that yesterday I heard him saying that he's a Presbyterian, I guess he's a presbyter, an elder in the Presbyterian church, But he's also Catholic. You can't be both at the same time. But again, the reason he's doing it is because he's been brainwashed by the left. He hears what he wants to hear. He likes what he wants to like. And everything he does reflects that. Because the left says you can do whatever you want. There's no limits. And Hugh Hewitt likes to hear that. We all like to hear it. And it's fun to entertain that for about 10 minutes. And then after that, we really need to get back to work. So again, Hugh Hewitt can't even be bothered to call himself a conservative. Why listen to him? Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, chapter 28 of The Enemies of My Country.
28. Duchess mentally processed the current radio transmissions with a mounting sense of concern that everything was most definitely not going to be okay. David's initial reports about the assault were virtually incoherent, and she seriously questioned whether he'd sustained some kind of head injury. Now he was on a tirade, providing a stream of consciousness rant that Duchess visualized Gosweiler reading on the mission transcript even as she heard it. "They know my family," David continued. "I want a protective detail on my wife and daughter yesterday, along with my entire team's next of kin." At his first pause, she asked, "What's the status of the cargo?" "Fuck the cargo. Do you hear what I'm telling you? They have the info on my family. I just found the names in the CP." Sighing, Duchess made her announcement to the outfit. "Notify the FBI. We'll need low-vis protective details deployed at once. I'll wave them off if this turns out to be nothing." Which, she thought, it almost certainly would. Whether David had sustained a concussion or otherwise gone delirious in the course of the fight, she wasn't sure. But she knew one thing for certain. Whatever David thought he knew, he was wrong. The only explanation for a link to his family was a personal vendetta, and there was zero chance one of those was playing out in Syria with the help of an ISIS-supported Chinese dissident pulling the strings. Duchess had initiated FBI support for one reason alone, so that she wouldn't have to lie on her next transmission. "It's in the works. Now focus." "I am focused. You need to listen to what I'm saying. I'm looking at the scrap with my wife's and daughter's names on it." "What scrap? What's the status of the cargo?" "Jesus, woman. All right, your precious cargo is flooding out of the city in an estimated 24 civilian cars and trucks. We stopped some of it still getting inventory, but I'd be surprised if more than 10% is still here. You need to stop all traffic on the highway and start checking vehicles, especially any with bullet holes or body damage." Duchess shook her head. He'd just described a significant portion of vehicles anywhere in Syria, and probably half of them originating from Ibrahim Kel. And with the logistical issues in deploying the strike force to that far-flung city in the first place, no magic wand would help them now. No, she thought. Any hope of stopping the rockets would have to occur at the border. "I understand," she transmitted back. "The first element of the strike force is moving on foot to your position. We'll be on site within 10 minutes. We're prepared for link-up. Now tell me about this intel you found." "The enemy command post was vaporized by an explosive charge, and we're sifting through scraps of paper at this point. I've got a sat phone and 2 laptops that are partially intact and need immediate analysis. Most of the writing we found is in Arabic, but the information on my fucking family, that's in English." Duchess lowered her mic, glancing sidelong at the woman beside her. Joanne's face conveyed the unspoken accusation that Duchess had handpicked this team leader, which was true, and that she'd chosen poorly. That latter part may have been true as well, Duchess thought. She didn't have all the facts, but David's words cast a shadow on the inerasable transcript of a mission that had been called into question long before that point. Gosweiler was soon going to learn that Duchess had contradicted his direct order by authorizing an additional ground raid by her agency team, and whether or not he would view the threat against the president as a worthy justification for that split-second judgment call remained to be seen. Unable to bear Joanne's glare any longer, Duchess said, "Spit it out." Joanne shrugged. "Your man is losing it." "Yeah," Duchess agreed. "No shit." Then she looked to the communications support rep and said, "S6, set up a direct line to my desk. I need to speak with the strike force commander."
29. Worthy approached Cancer as he spoke quietly to David, both men standing in the open compound amid the aftermath of the team's raid. The fight was over, any surviving enemy having long since decided that discretion was the better part of valor. Worthy would have liked to think that was due to the ferocity of his team alone, but their early warning network alerting them to helicopters approaching the outskirts of Ibrahim Kel was probably the determining factor. The strike force had already touched down and was proceeding on foot to the compound, and so far any remaining enemy in town hadn't taken so much as a pot shot at them. Besides, Worthy thought, why would they bother? They'd already been successful, or mostly so. The vast majority of their cargo was already en route to whatever destination Bari Khan had dictated, and a handful of those rockets was sufficient to cause tremendous damage. A few hundred of them spelled a catastrophe in the making, and that's exactly what was occurring now. Nizar had been monitoring the radio in their captured ISIS truck, even sending a few hopeful transmissions in an attempt to procure some intel. But the radio remained silent. The enemy knew their frequency had been compromised, and there was no way to tell how many were hidden throughout the city or otherwise proceeding alongside their cargo, currently dispersed across a fleet of civilian vehicles that had long since departed. Leaving David's side, Cancer moved to one of their captured ISIS trucks and climbed aboard, stripping the black flag from its mast. He bundled the fabric and carried it away, probably for later hanging as a team room trophy. Though what they'd make of this chapter of their team history in the aftermath, Worthy wasn't sure. On one hand, they'd overcome incredible odds in making it this far, continually improvising to stay on the trail from the moment they'd discovered the rockets. On the other, their best efforts had fallen far short of recovering them. Now they'd been relegated to consolidating their defensive perimeter, assembling an open view for the imminent link-up with the special operations soldiers who'd be arriving at any second. Riley approached him and asked, "You still feeling all right? Any changes to vision?" Worthy shook his head. "No, I'm fine. That grenade rang my bell pretty good is all. Spent most of the fight drooling on myself." Cancer reappeared, speaking over his shoulder. "Learned to take a grenade blast like a man, race gun?" Riley looked irritated at this comment, but Worthy just nodded and said, "Yeah, I gotta work on that." He knew that Cancer had dragged him to safety, and the crusty sniper seemed compelled to rectify that momentary glimpse of his humanity by assuring everyone as quickly as possible that he was indeed still dead inside. Then Riley continued, "You start getting dizzy, seeing stars, feeling nauseous, and I want you to tell me right away. I will, but so far I'm good to go." This was half true at least. He did feel nauseous, his stomach deeply unsettled, as if he'd vomit at any moment. But his vision was clear, and upon testing the reflexes of his hands, he found that his motor control had returned in full. He could still fight, and that was all that mattered. Besides, he was more concerned with his team leader. David was as emotionally unstable as Worthy had ever seen him. One minute, he seemed totally composed, conversing with the team as if it was business as usual, a normal day at the office. The next, he'd lapse into a stony silence or begin pacing restlessly, or stop to stare at Elias's body. Right now, he was doing the latter. Worthy stopped beside David and said, "What do you make of your family's names in the CP?" David spat into the dirt. "It makes exactly as much sense as any of the rest of it. We've got a Uyghur dissident turned Muslim extremist who made his way to Syria, decides to attack the U.S. instead of China, and then picks a nondescript college town in central Virginia for his effort. The record of my family is just one more ridiculous thing added to the shit show." He fell silent as a radio transmission came over their team frequency. "Suicide, this is Zombie 3-3. 27 Eagles prepared to make entry." David huffed a frustrated sigh and transmitted back, "Come on in. Try not to shoot the 5 gringos and a Syrian standing here like assholes." Ending his transmission, he spoke to his team. "All right, boys, get 'em up." Cancer whispered, "God, this is so undignified." The men raised their arms over their heads in unison, leaving their rifles slung and pointed downward. Granted, the guys waiting outside the compound were literal and figurative grandmasters of hostage rescue, and thus highly unlikely to shoot anyone who didn't require it, but the team wasn't taking any chances. The shooters utilized the gate entrance and vehicle pathways to make a simultaneous and silent entry.
The operators' movements were poetry, an expert choreography of synchronized motion as their formations dissolved into two-man elements that began clearing every facet of the compound perimeter as quickly as Worthy could process the sight. A pair of operators approached the team, and Worthy could tell by the long radio antenna emerging from the second man's assault pack that the first was the commander. His suspicion was confirmed when the lead operator stopped before them and announced, "Taylor, troop commander." David stepped forward and spoke unenthusiastically. "David, team lead. Have any trouble finding the place?" Taylor smiled. "What do you got so far?" David pulled a notepad and consulted it. 13 rockets found in the remaining cars. With 4 destroyed earlier, that leaves 635 at large. Ian corrected him. 633. 633, David echoed, then pointed to the door in the far building. "Command post is in there. Just follow the smell of smoke. We consolidated all the intel we could, but there's not much left." Worthy saw that Riley had turned into a tactical lecher, shamelessly examining the operator's equipment. And to be fair, that equipment was pretty badass. Seeing Tier 1 guys in full kit was like seeing your first Playboy in 5th grade. An awe-invoking experience that you would never, ever forget. Taylor was saying, "We'll get it all sped to the rear for analysis," and he was interrupted by Riley, who jabbed a blood-stained finger at a pouch on the man's gear. "Are those the GP-NVG-18s? "Hell yeah," Taylor said. "Why? What are you guys wearing for night vision?" Riley cut his eyes to cancer. "We gotta talk to Duchess about this bullshit." The operator nodded. "Seriously, agency can afford it." David asked, "How'd you guys make out at Sapaya?" "We gave better than we got. Didn't lose anyone, and that's something. How'd you all hold up?" "Shit, man, you're looking at it." The man's eyes swept across the team. Every member filthy beyond recognition, eyes hollow after 25 hours awake, with over half that time spent in continual combat engagements. Then he looked across the objective, strewn with dead bodies between the remaining cars, and gave a nod of understanding. Then he said, "My orders are to escort your team to a chopper for transport to Fob Presley for follow-on movement back to the States." "Bullshit," David shot back. "We need to cross-load ammunition from your men and stay in the fight. I've got 4 shooters, plus myself and a local guide who can accompany you to find this cargo before it's gone." "Sorry, brother. We're full up on shooters." David's expression fell into a deadpan stare normally reserved for the moments before a fistfight. Cancer stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Suicide. It's over." David spun and marched over to an operator closing on Elias's body to search it. "Get away from him," David yelled. "He's one of ours." The soldier stopped to let David approach the body. Worthy watched David kneel before Elias, seemingly in a moment of prayer. But that wasn't David's style, Worthy knew, and he saw his team leader instead pat down the dead intelligence agent's pockets, reaching inside one and standing once he'd recovered the contents. His prize was Elias's lighter and pack of Marlboros, and David put a cigarette between his lips before lighting it. Ian took a step to Worthy's side, asking in disbelief, "He's smoking?" "Yep." "Shit," Ian remarked. "It's going to be a long flight home." 30. Duchess sat before the photographs of her family, stomach knotted with the burden of doing what she despised most, waiting. For her last 2 hours in the Opsen, she wanted nothing more than a mug of tea. Now that she was back in her office with a freshly brewed cup, she couldn't stand the thought of drinking it. Instead, she tried to savor the most respite she'd had since the mission began. The silence of her office, devoid of the radio chatter of ground troops and contractors and pilots, free of the constant updates on the status of UAVs and transport aircraft. None of that mattered at present. She'd updated Gosweiler's office with the outcome of the failed raid along with the presidential threat and had heard nothing in response. Meanwhile, an alphabet soup of governmental agencies was combing through the roster of people with access to the president's schedule, looking for connections that could signify a traitor in the ranks. Now it was a waiting game. Everyone had been informed of the rockets. Every sensor and agent had their ear to the ground, waiting for the slightest indication to emerge. Military assets had been stood up and forward deployed, aircraft fueled and ready to whisk them into a seizure operation at a moment's notice. But so far, nothing had come over the net. Not the slightest whisper of intercepted communications, not a single report from a field source, not a notable surveillance aircraft snapshot of a bullet-riddled vehicle traveling among the hundreds traversing the highways north toward the Turkish border. When her phone finally rang, Duchess snatched the receiver immediately, prepared to run back to the ops end. "Status?" she asked. "No updates on the cargo, ma'am," a man replied without urgency, "but the team made it back to Fob Presley. I've got the team leader for you on the red line." She felt her shoulders fall as she fixed her gaze on the picture of her son. "Put him through. Stand by." Duchess heard a click over the line, then a faint background static that preceded David Rivers' voice. "We could have stayed in the fight." Great introduction, she thought. 7 words into the conversation, and he'd already pissed her off. "That's not your call to make, and there is no fight. The last shots fired in anger were from your team, and even if that wasn't the case, it's time for you to come home." "How appropriate," he quipped, "because my home is exactly what I'm concerned about." She sighed. "The FBI protective details have been shadowing your team's next of kin for almost 2 hours. There have been 0 suspicious indicators. Would you prefer we force them all into protective custody?" "Yeah, that'd go over real well, considering we're officially on a milk run in Jordan right now. You think it's easy to sustain a marriage while working for you? It's not. Not all of us have as much practice at lying as your organization does, though I dare say I'm catching up. What have you found out?" Duchess gritted her teeth, thinking that if she were speaking to any normal subordinate, she'd fire them on the spot. But as much as she hated to admit it, she understood David's frustration. She'd seen the preliminary photographs of the intelligence he found, and her first reaction was that if her family's names had been on the paper, she wouldn't have responded much differently than he did. And that's exactly what she sought to deal with now. She said, "We have identified the target of the terrorist attack." "Which is?" Duchess felt a mirthless smile cross her lips. The presidential visit to Monticello with the Indian president still hadn't been officially announced, and David was the last person who needed to know about that particular item on the itinerary. "You don't need to know. I'm the first person who needs to know. Do you have any idea what it took for us to follow the cargo? You think you can find a team who'd deliver what we did? Go right ahead and hire them. Until then, don't keep me in the dark when it's my family on the line, especially when this leak could have come from your fucking office. You want to accuse me of something," she fired back, "then come right out and say it. But you've got a lot of nerve talking to me like that after I put my head on the chopping block for your team more times than I care to count since you identified the rockets. So you could start by showing me a modicum of respect, particularly after your little stunt with the logistician jumped off a building and escaped my ass." He remained silent, and Duchess took a breath to steady her anger before continuing. "What you do need to know is that the terrorist attack would generate a large number of casualties, and because of the target's location, survivors would be taken to the university hospital. We suspect your wife's and daughter's names originated from Lila's employee records. That doesn't mean they were targeted individually. It means the entire hospital was targeted for a second attack, designed to kill survivors from the first." She paused then, allowing the information to sink in. The truth she couldn't say was that the casualty count probably didn't matter to Bari Khan. If the rocket strike didn't kill the U.S. and Indian presidents outright, he intended to ensure his victory by detonating a bomb at the exact location both men would be taken to for extensive medical treatment. And if he did kill them outright, the university hospital would simply be the icing on the cake. David replied, "So what's being done to stop this?" "We're covering every possible port and border crossing. Coalition partners have been informed, and we've spun up multinational intelligence assets at the highest levels." "The highest levels, huh? Sounds like this is a pretty important target BK is going after. Any threat to our citizens represents an important target." "What about Nizar? He was in as much danger as any of us, and—" Duchess cut him off. "Not that you asked my permission before committing agency assets to a relocation, but I will honor that agreement. Nizar and his family will be relocated to a state of his choosing." After a pause, David said, "Thank you. There's a bigger team at play here. You guys dodge bullets, yes, but those of us supporting you have to negotiate a political minefield, myself included. And all that matters right now is finding the cargo." "What about my men?" Duchess leaned back in her chair, deciding how to frame her message. "You'll fly home on the first bird back to the States. That wasn't my call, but I'd make the same choice if it was. We can refit and go back out, after which, she cut him off again, you will be on an extended hiatus in recognition of your outstanding service over the course of this mission. A hiatus, he replied. Sounds suspiciously like fired. She felt her neck flush with heat. David was fired, of course, and within a week's time, so was she. But there was no reason to say that to a man in his current emotional state. She'd allow him the dignity of bringing his team stateside, let them turn in their equipment and return home before locking them out of their facility for good. By then, she'd be handing over control of Project Longwing to some Gosweiler-appointed successor, and the great game would be over, along with her career. She said non-committally, think of it more like R&R. I'll be sure to manage as much rest and relaxation as I can with the knowledge that there's a terrorist plot in my hometown. That terrorist plot, she said firmly, is being dismantled as we speak. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to get back to work. By all means, David said. She opened her mouth to reply, but heard the line go dead. That kid is a real asshole, she thought, as the feeling of nausea returned to her stomach. Duchess hung up the receiver, then set her elbows atop the desk, and watched the phone as she waited for it to ring again.
And that was chapters 28, 29, and 30 of The Enemies of My Country by Jason Casper. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States. Today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.